Hey everyone, welcome to the Tiny House Summit. I'm your host, Ethan Waldman, and I'm here with Joshua Engberg. Joshua started planning to build a tiny house in June of 2014 in order to simplify his life and get back to basics and escape the high cost of living in the San Francisco Bay Area. Joshua has a background in custom trailers and metal fabrication, and his partner Shelly in interior design. They started downsizing and designing their custom tiny house. The original plan was to build their own tiny house trailer, but instead they designed a custom frame and had it built to their exact specs from a factory. With the help of many of their talented friends, they built their own self-designed 374 square foot home in a few short months. Reflecting on the challenges of the build, they realized one of the biggest was the trailer and getting one custom to their needs, and that's how Tiny House Basics was born. Joshua, welcome to the summit.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Ethan.
Yeah, great to have you here. And this will be our session for, I'm sure most participants will watch it because this is like the basics, the trailers, and it's right in your company's name, Tiny House Basics. And trailer really is one of the basic parts.
It is. Yeah, it's the biggest it's a lot of times the biggest portion of the build, especially when you're doing DIY builds, and it's kind of the thing that you have to figure out first. It is the perimeter size, the square footage of your tiny house. So it's a very, very crucial decision. It's something that requires a lot of thought in, but it's also something that can be super overwhelming for people. Um, yeah.
Totally. And it's also like, as you said, it's oftentimes the biggest single expense in a tiny house build, so it's not one to take lightly.
Yeah.
Um, so I was actually just realizing that this is right about the 10-year anniversary for me of well, I started the house in 2012, so we're at like a 10-year build anniversary. I was like right in the middle of my build 10 years ago, and when I did mine, I picked up a utility trailer from a local trailer manufacturer. It had rounded wheel wells and pressure treated decking, and I peeled off every other board and did that classic kind of tumbleweed build. So I'm curious, just to start, you know, you and several other companies have been making tiny house specific trailers now for quite a bit of time. What's the difference between like the utility trailer that I bought and a tiny house specific trailer?
Yeah, there's a couple major components. I'd say the most obvious one is the width. Is
Okay.
a standard utility trailer. The deck is built in between the wheels, like yours was. You have the fenders on the outside of that deck because that's a utility trailer. You're loading up equipment onto it, lumber, debris, or however it's configured. So you have the 82-inch wide surface area, or that deck width that you build your tiny house inside those wheel wells. And that's what Tumbleweed did. They basically took a modified utility trailer and then they built all their walls inside those fenders. And they did not encapsulate the fenders at all. So you had a much more narrow footprint. And then with a tiny house specific trailer, outside of the engineering, you have a full usable deck as wide as the fenders can go. So majority of people go up to 102 inches wide for the deck. Now that is the maximum width to not have to pull any permits in the United States. It's 102 inches wide or 8.5 feet wide. So that deck is the full width of the trailer, and you frame over the fenders like you treat them like windows. You would frame over them like a window opening. You're able to utilize that extra 20 inches, 10 inches on each side. So that's a massive square footage increase for not that much additional effort of, getting a specific trailer. And then on top of that, the engineering, it's built to handle the load around the perimeter of the trailer and not have the unnecessary steel or components that you don't need that you would need on a utility trailer. Because all the weight on a utility trailer is going to be in the center area. You're going to have wood decking like you described that you had. Cross members are a little bit more funky on a utility trailer because they're ideal for, supporting a load in that space. Whereas a tiny house trailer, the weight is distributed around that perimeter. So they look, relatively the same, for to the untrained eye, but there's just huge advantages to actually getting something specifically built for a tiny house, and then also how that tiny house trailer is designed, because there is some differences, but we can get into that later. Um, but because once you build the tiny house, you can't change the trailer. I mean, I've seen it on a couple of cases, but it's not cheap and not easy.
No.
So it's always best to just start off on the right foot, get a trailer built to handle that load. And it's just something you never have to worry about in the future, because there's going to be plenty of things that you're going to worry about and stress about. And the trailer absolutely should not be that. Once you check that off, move on to the next. And you shouldn't be dwelling about, should you have done this or should you have done that?
Yeah, I definitely second all that, and I would say that you know I always recommend that people buy a new trailer for the same reasons you just mentioned. It's the foundation of your house. I haven't heard of anybody changing out the trailer, so that's I'd be interested in hearing more about that, but I wouldn't ever attempt to do that or plan a build thinking that I could do that. Um, and if you're going to buy a new trailer, you might as well buy one that's made for tiny houses rather than something that's generic, because it's going to make that construction process
Yeah.
a lot
And you
easier.
don't even know, too, by buying a new trailer, you know exactly what it's been through. It's built exactly for you.
Yeah,
When you're buying a used trailer, you don't know its life before.
yeah,
I've had a lot of trailers, a lot of experience towing, and when I've had a good amount of utility trailers, some would be overloaded many times. And I
yeah.
used to say that this trailer didn't owe me anything at its period of its life, like a utility trailer, because I
Right.
used it heavily for 4 or 5 years. If it got stolen and I didn't get a dime from it, I already got my money's worth, because it is a tool to be used, and you wouldn't want to subject the foundation of your house to that. You're
No,
not buying a used foundation or concrete. Be like, yeah, I'll just glue it together. I don't know what it's been through. You want to be sure by using, starting off on the right foot.
for sure, for sure. Well, in the years since I built, um, there have been I kind of had blinders on. I feel like I looked at what Tumbleweed did, and that's kind of the model that I used. There are a couple of different styles of trailers that I've seen that I want to just give people an overview on. And the first one I thought to talk about was the idea of a deck over trailer. Can you describe what that is and what the kind of advantages and disadvantages are of a deck over
Yeah,
trailer?
so there's a couple main types, and starting off with the deck over. So let's say the main type is a standard trailer with exposed
Yep.
fenders. They could be radius, rounded, or square. And then the other type is a deck over. It is the least popular style trailer for, well, what we build. Maybe like one out of every 75, 80 trailers is a deck over. But there's
Wow.
some clear advantages to that. The deck over has a totally flat deck, and it encapsulates the wheels. So it is over the wheels. A standard deck trailer is about 26 inches off the ground. A deck over has to be like 36 inches off the ground, because it needs to be higher than those wheels. The wheels are generally
Yeah.
around 32 to 34 inches tall. So that deck has to be high enough to allow suspension travel and still cover the tires. The advantages of that is you have of a deck over is you have a freedom of no fenders to deal with. It's ideal if you're not doing a loft. A deck over is a good trailer style to not do a loft on, because you do have
Yeah.
that lower, interior space. But you have that freedom for design, and in kind of our similar fashion as what we've done, we always like to kind of be the guinea pigs on things for us personally. So we're building
Yeah.
a second tiny house as an addition to the one we live in, and we chose our
Oh, cool.
least popular style. We're doing a deck over, um, but the reason we did that is because we did 30 feet long by 10, and it's a deck over. So we have 9 foot long doors on the sides, and then an 8 foot wide door on the back. So they open at the corner, but it would have been right where the fender is. It just would have ruined what we wanted to do aesthetically for the design. So a deck over really
Yeah.
was the perfect choice for that. We don't have to worry about fenders, nothing like that. So that in that case, it's very, very popular style for people if they want that freedom for design. Um, but the negatives is you don't want it. You can't do a loft, or it's going to be micro tiny,
Hmm.
and it is a more expensive trailer because does use a lot more steel. And then it is a
Ah,
much higher
okay.
approach angle into, the house. So more steps might not be ideal for those that don't like climbing stairs or those who are, advanced in age. Sometimes it's not the best configuration, but it does have its purpose in the tiny house world, and we're super excited for ours. So, but it's been
Yeah,
taking
I'll
the back
bet.
seat for other builds. So
Yeah, I've always liked the idea of a deck over, and I agree. The it kind of negates the possibility of a sleeping loft. Um, but it also, especially if you're building for a really cold climate, like I'm in Vermont, those wheel wells, you know, provide or offer a challenge thermally, to keep them well
yeah,
insulated kind of around
yeah,
them.
absolutely.
And, if you don't have to deal with those at all, then great, you've got a better kind of thermal envelope.
Yeah, and a hybrid design could be, and when we've done a lot of these, is a deck over gooseneck. So because a lot of
Ah,
people do a bedroom in the gooseneck, and so you're going to have the stairs
yep.
going up to that. So by having a deck over, we'll just pretend this is the gooseneck. The deck over is
Yep.
closer. You have less steps going to that gooseneck. You could still stand up in
Mm,
there. And most people that are doing gooseneck trailers, they're not necessarily doing huge sleeping lofts in the main space. So that's kind of a
mhm.
perfect hybrid of the advantages of a deck over and then the advantages of a gooseneck.
Nice. Well, that's a great transition into talking about, goosenecks versus, I would refer to it as a bumper pole, but tell me, is that the same terminology that you use?
I say bumper pull or gooseneck. So those two different styles.
Okay. Yeah.
And so
Okay.
bumper pull is the one with the triangular hitch that
Mhm.
attaches to the hitch that's at the rear of your bumper. That's kind of how it gets its name, bumper pull. And then the
Mhm.
gooseneck is the fifth wheel style. So gooseneck, fifth wheel. They're kind of the same
Yep.
looking style trailer. They kind of look like a goose. It kind of has a gooseneck that arches over the bed of the truck, and the weight of that trailer is placed directly onto a hitch that is over the axles. So gooseneck trailers are more stable at their longer lengths to build. You have that advantage of being able to do a bedroom in that gooseneck section. Like our standard goosenecks are 8 feet long upper deck. So that's a good size for a
Okay.
bedroom. People will also do 10 feet long. Um, yeah, that is a more ideal trailer to move around. But on the flip side, most people that are getting goosenecks are in the neighborhood, for us anyway, are in the neighborhood of like 40 feet long goosenecks, 32 plus 8. Our largest to date gooseneck is a 50 foot by 12. And
Wow.
yeah, it can tow better for sure, but nobody's traveling with a 50 foot by 12 trailer. I think it's, people are wanting it for the design, kind of having less steps to walk into a bedroom. And then kind of like the deck over, it is more expensive per linear foot of trailer. So if you're kind of thinking about keeping notes on what features are kind of premiums, a gooseneck definitely is a premium option. A deck over is a premium option because they're just more complicated to build. But that doesn't
Mhm.
stop people because, I mean, it's a great trailer. I mean, Shelly, my wife, always wanted us to do a gooseneck, so because you just have that standing up bedroom, because um, crawling into a loft, our loft right here can, sometimes get old. We've been in our tiny house for 8 years now. And so if we were going to do one totally, from scratch, not with the addition, but just one, it would probably be a gooseneck because it's a very practical layout for long term tiny house living. But, it's all hyper
Definitely.
personal. That's just preference. So,
Definitely. And that's an interesting. So, do you have a rule of thumb or something that you use to advise people to say, like, at this point you should consider a gooseneck instead of a bumper pole?
um, we commonly do bumper pulls up to about 36 feet by 10.
Uh-huh.
And then we also do 40-foot bumper pulls, which is a very large bumper pull. But the gooseneck kind of comes in, I would say, at roughly around, for popularity, roughly around the 28-foot size. So, like, when you're 28 foot for the lower deck and you add that 8 foot to be a 36 foot, that's kind of when the goosenecks kind of hit the stage. Like, that's when they kind of come into popularity for people that are getting them. So 28-foot lower deck, 8 foot gooseneck, and then
Yeah.
on up in every increment. If somebody is, and we do have some people that have requested this, like they want like a 12-foot long gooseneck. I'm sorry, 12-foot long lower deck, 8 foot gooseneck, 20 feet overall. That's not really a practical length because it's very costly for that size. We can absolutely do it, and we have done it, but a gooseneck I think is kind of more reserved for the. It makes more financial sense when you're at the lower deck is in the mid 20s on up.
Got it. Got it. And would you say I kind of want to ask you just because it's fascinating to me, and I think it'll be interesting to people too. Like, what is the most common size trailer that you're making these days, and in terms of length and also width? Because I've heard you mention 10 feet a lot, and that's a 10 foot wide trailer is going to require some permitting, right?
Yes, yeah. So anything over 8.5 feet wide will require a wide
Yeah.
load permit, and that category is kind of 8 feet 7 inches, right over 8.5, all the way up to like
Mm-hmm.
11 feet 11. That's kind of a wide load permit, no pilot cars for majority of 50 states. When you hit that 12
Mm-hmm.
foot wide mark, you need a pilot car, and it gets more complicated. But it's always good to just hire a professional shipper for that. But the most
Yep.
popular trailer we build, and it's been tracking since 2007 16. They've been kind of getting more and more popular. Is, I think you know where it's going, but 10 feet wide is the single most popular trailer we build, and we found that 10 feet wide is seems way it is way more practical for people long term. So people that are in a 10-foot wide tiny house, like 30 by 10 is the single most popular size we've been building this year, and then
Mm-hmm.
that's 32 and 34 after that. um, but the 10-foot wides have been a lot more practical for longer term living for people. They've also been more appealing when people are building them for Airbnbs. There's still definitely a place for 8.5 feet wide, but I think majority of people are wanting to make this investment and this planning, last
Mm-hmm.
a very, very long time. And so I always kind of say, if you're considering 10 feet wide, you should really do it, because nobody ever regrets it that we've ever interacted with or built a trailer for. They're always so happy that
Mm-hmm.
they just made that jump to the 10 feet wide. You just have, 15% more square footage and width. It's just way more, I'm sorry, or a foot and a half more square footage interior width. And it's just, you have way more flexibility on design. You don't feel like in a tunnel walking through each other. So that is totally why
Mm-hmm.
we did 30 by 10. I mean, there's just no question for our next build that we were going to do
Yeah.
30 by 10. Um, so yeah, it's really kind of, I feel like right now it's probably 10 feet wides outsell almost about 2 to 1 for 8.5 foot wides.
Wow. Yeah, and I, I'll just toss in my 2 cents on that, which is that I also, I wish I had gone 10 because I've moved my house 3 times in 10 years. And that's not very many times to have to deal with the permitting and the route planning and all that, to get that kind of that livability and that little extra bit of
Yeah.
space.
And along those lines of the moving part, we just moved our tiny house. It's been sitting for 8 years at our previous spot we rent. And then we finally able, because of tiny house living, to save up money. We purchased property in Sonoma County, and we moved our tiny
Mm-hmm.
house there. It's 28 feet, 8.5 feet wide. But the challenge we actually
Mm-hmm.
found with our particular tiny house, it was almost too light and too narrow. That it
Mm.
was challenging to tow because our siding is aluminum. We used a lot of lightweight materials. So it didn't have that like girth, and it was like really skinny and long. And granted, we would have done stuff differently had we known in 2014, because was our as we say, our first pancake. Um, but 10 feet wide is more of a substantial structure. You have, when you're pulling the permits or you're hiring a shipper, you have those routes already figured out. They're much easier. And so, like, moving our new one when we do, which we'll probably bring up before the end of the year, I'm not stressed about that one at all. It's bigger. I have triple axles. It's heavier, which seems like an oxymoron or whatever, but I'm not worried about moving that one. Stressful moving this one.
Interesting.
And I think it's just because this is our baby, I mean, it's still our home. So,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
not a fun day moving the tiny house.
No. Okay. Good to know. Good to know. Um let's talk about the like different types of steel. Um and what, what you use on your trailers and kind of what you recommend. I'm kind of thinking, like, I know on my trailer the outer frame is all C channel, so it's, shaped like a C, and then the ribs are kind of L shaped. Um and but the tiny house trailers that I've seen more recently don't use those same materials.
Yeah, so angle iron or the L bracket, which is really, really common
Yep.
on utility trailers, because you kind of just need a little bit of strength, and your deck most likely was 2x6s running lengthwise
Yep.
on the angle iron cross members. The angle iron doesn't really have that kind of structural rigidity for flexing, kind of like if you're looking at like an artist's easel, it doesn't really have the same rigidity.
Yep.
um,
Yep.
but it's enough for sufficient for its job, which was as a utility trailer. C channels
Mm-hmm.
is really, really common on landscape trailers or utility trailers. It's much more of a
Yep.
difficult steel to work with when it comes to drilling into or attaching screws for a plywood subfloor, because you're going to be doing a lot of penetrations into the steel over the course of your subfloor installation, or if you're doing
Yep.
flashing underneath. So C channel is fussy because C channel, it's skinnier. Like if this is the top of the C, it's thinner at the tip
Mm-hmm.
and then it gets thicker and thicker. So the closer you get to like the
Mm.
edge of the long, the close end, it gets more and more difficult to drill through. Um, I would say it's
Mm-hmm.
not.
Mm-hmm.
It comes down to a preference, I would say, on what the manufacturer is choosing. Sometimes C channel is a little bit cheaper, but for building, we only use box tube frames on our trailers. So main frames, depending on the size, are generally a 6-inch tall by 2-inch wide box tube, and then bigger trailers will have 8-inch tall. And then, yeah, depending on the size, when we go to our really, really big ones, like 48 feet, sometimes the main frame will have an I beam, so a very, very strong, structural steel. Um, and then cross
Okay.
members, we also do box tube cross members as well. So they're anywhere from 3 inches tall by 2 inches wide, or 4 inches tall by 2 inches wide. And so they
Okay.
resemble almost like a 2x4, and easier to land, a screw or a drill bit on when you're attaching your subfloor. Way easier and more kind of like,
Right.
second nature when you're doing the subfloor on our trailer. Um, and another thing is on our subfloors of our trailer, it's a uniform design where we're actually using the cross members go the full width to the 102 if you choose that deck width, and then you have that box tube railing on the outer side of the trailer, so you can uniformly insulate the whole trailer deck. Some trailer manufacturers in the tiny house space still kind of do like a modified car hauler where it's an 82-inch wide deck, cross members that are box tube, but they do a flange on the outside,
Mm-hmm.
like a 1/4 inch flange.
Okay.
And they say that it's easier to build with, but the problem with that design is you have this really thick steel in an uninsulated space underneath that flange that is totally exposed to the elements. And even if you would have to do a bunch of extra steps to close it in. And even with that, because it is such a thick steel, it's led to a lot of cases of mold underneath the rough framing of the wall. And so that design is really kind of like a subpar design, just because it has a lot of complications with, especially in a cold environment. I mean, you're in Vermont, that steel flange is going to take a long, long time to get up to room temperature before, the interior space, which leads to a lot of condensation and stuff like that. But
Yeah.
primary outside of the flange design from ours and, versus the other companies, um, we all, box tube is kind of the preference to go with. So box tube is way easier to drill
Okay.
into, attach, weld onto, any type of modification. It's a lot easier for the build.
Something that I don't remember who said it to me, but I remember hearing a concern about drilling into box tube and then potentially having water get into the tube and not be able to get out. Do you have to do anything special when you fasten into box tube to kind of seal that up, or is it not really a
Well,
concern?
for it to be able to get in,
Uh-huh.
you would have to have water coming from above. And a lot of times
Mhm.
so I just in practical, use, I haven't seen that be any type of issue of water getting in and that
Okay.
can't get out. Now, cross members, there are a good amount of, on our cross member design where there'll be a little bit of opening between the welds on the bottom of the cross
Mhm.
member so water can get out. But the fact of the matter is like when you're going through the building process and you're drilling and into the box tube, and you're attaching that plywood subfloor to the trailer deck, it's common practice to use construction adhesive, so glue and then screw the plywood down to the trailer.
Mhm.
So it would be very, very hard, unless that subfloor is out in the direct elements, being rained and snowed on year out of year, for it to ever get any type of water inside the frame. And I mean, we did our subfloor exactly like that, and we've been in ours, 8 years now. And I fully inspected the trailer, every detail before we moved it. It's been sitting in the same spot, and even feedback
Okay.
from customers, it's kind of a non-issue. Um, and kind of along those
Nice.
lines too, some people ask about getting it waterproof underneath because of splashing up from the road. But that's kind of what the fenders do, is they contain that water where something is contacting the road, which is the tires. And I've never seen any
Okay.
water splash up in the middle because nothing's contacting the road in the middle. Um, but it is
Okay.
good to have, maybe if you're doing flashing yourself, to have a little bit of spots for drainage. If you do have a flood, worst case scenario. So
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Um this has been so incredibly valuable, and I think I hope people are taking notes, like because this is just a great education on trailer basics. There were a couple of quick ones that I wanted to touch on before we wrap up, which is just kind of house attachment methods of like how you secure your house to the trailer. um, Tires and wheels and brakes. Those are the three bullets that I have left over, so let's
okay.
see if we can get through them. So maybe let's start with house attachment, since we've been talking about like some construction techniques and the thermal envelope, and so how do people attach their houses to their trailers, I guess.
Um, there may be some ways out there that I haven't seen yet, but the preferred method and the recommended method is to almost treat it like a regular house foundation, and to tie down the
Uh-huh.
wall framing to the trailer using threaded rods. Now these rods
Okay.
you can get them at Home Depot in different lengths or a construction supply, but it basically looks like a big screw that's about like 4 to 6 feet long, and you can either bolt them on through by drilling through the trailer
Mm-hmm.
frame, which is totally okay, and have it a nut on the bottom, nut
Mm-hmm.
on top. Or a preferred method is to weld them on. We can weld them on at our
Okay.
factory, or you can weld them on yourself. And so this threaded rod will stick up above the trailer deck, and about 8 to 10 inches. And so the purpose of this is the ideal location, first off, for the purpose, is about 10 inches from each corner, 10 inches before and
Mm-hmm.
after the fender, and then 4 feet in the field. So whatever that spacing is.
Okay.
So you have more than enough right there. Then when you are doing your base plate for your rough framing, um, you'll drill a relief for the threaded rod to come through, and that threaded rod is intended to attach to the king stud. And there is a part, it's called by Simpson Strong Ties, it's called an HTT4 or an HTT5.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, it's a bracket that kind of nails to the king stud, slips over the threaded rod with a washer and a nut. And that is tying down that structure down to the trailer and sandwiching them together. So that is a standard, foundation tie method in traditional construction or for hurricane climates. And so that is still
Mm-hmm.
the ideal recommended way to attach the wall framing to the trailer. And yeah, and so you do it on every king stud. And when we do it at that default location, you have more than enough threaded rods that say, hey, your door is going to be here and there's a threaded rod right there. You can easily just cut it off because there's more than a sufficient way to tie them
Cool.
down. So,
Cool. All right. Amazing. Thank you. What about tires and wheels? I know that um, I've advised people to, if their wheels have been sitting for a long time, if their tires have been sitting a long time, replace them before travel. Different grades of tire, different numbers of ply. Can
yeah.
you can you talk about those
Yeah. And
things?
I'm sure there's
Awesome.
probably going to be some people tie in overseas in Australia have see this. And a common
Yep.
thing we get
Yep.
here is a lot of people love a lot of the designs in New Zealand and Australia. Um, but we do have different tire sizes in the United States, and they're kind of like fixed heights
Uh
to
huh.
handle certain amount of loads. So our trailers tend to be a little bit taller
Okay.
than New Zealand or Australian trailers. So we can't do as high as like, New Zealand or and Australian tiny houses. So when you're getting a certain capacity rated axle, you're getting matching tires that will handle that load. So the minimum ply we recommend for a trailer tire is going
Mm-hmm.
to be like a 10 ply. That is more than sufficient. So a 10 ply radial tire. So it is just like a
Okay.
car tire, but it is only for trailer service. Like it will say trailer service only.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very specific tire for trailer service, but it's like a car tire that it's a radial. So radials kind of resist the old school way when we always think about bald spots or flat spots on tires. That would be like in bias ply tires, which are still available actually. You can get those on trailers still, but I definitely do not
Hmm.
recommend getting bias ply. I always just make sure it's a radial. Um, it's a cheaper
Okay.
tire. That's sometimes why you'll still see them out there. Um, but yeah, and I think the biggest thing to prepare longevity on tires is sun exposure. Cover them from UV elements. Keep them fully inflated. And the
Yep.
tiny house can sit on its wheels, on its tires with jacks for its life, or you can take them off. There is kind of like, several things going around where you have to take it off the tires, but it can stay on its tires if they're fully inflated, covered, protected from the elements. I mean, our tiny house sat 8 years on its tires, but they were fully covered up and they were in perfect shape. And when we transported them, I brought them all the way up to 80 psi, which is what was recommended, towed perfectly. But as a rule of thumb, tires generally have a life of about 6 years. That's car tires, trailer
Mm-hmm.
tires. But if they're kept in
Yeah.
really good shape, you can get more life out of them. But it's definitely cheap insurance to just block them from the sun. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. I bought a set of like inexpensive vinyl covers on Amazon, and it actually, I think it kind of looks slick to just have black covers over the wheels. And same thing. My tiny house sat for 6-7 years on those wheels, and before my most recent move, I was kind of hemming and hawing about whether or not to replace the tires before the move. And what I opted to do is I actually bought a full wheel and tire assembly from the same trailer shop. So I basically figured, all right, I'll have a spare tire that I can, rather than having to wait for AAA to come to replace my tire, I can jack the house up and change out the tire on the road if I need to. And
yeah,
I
yeah,
didn't
that's
need
it's
to.
always good and cheap insurance to have a spare tire. And if you had to
Yeah.
buy a whole new set of tires, tires are right now roughly around $220 to $250 a wheel, and that comes with the wheel and the tire.
Yeah.
So
Not cheap.
one spare is
Yeah.
better than having to buy a whole set.
Yeah.
And then another kind of like small point is about when you're going with axle sizes, the most common axle sizes for tiny houses are around 5,000 pounds, on a smaller trailer per
Mm-hmm.
axle, 5,000, 6,000, 7,000.
Yep.
7,000 is the
Okay.
most popular. Sometimes people request 8,000-pound capacity, which is not that common. But the difference is
Okay.
wheels and tires for those odd sizes, like 8,000 pounds, are extremely expensive, extremely hard to get. So if you did get a flat, like you said, you can easily go down and get a spare tire for
Mm.
a standard 7,000-pound axle. But an 8,000-pound, you're going to be hanging out on the side of the road.
Good to know. Very good to know. And that's an interesting point just to because I didn't ask you about axles, which is that you've got this choice between 2 and 3 axles. Like if you're trying to have a 15,000 pound capacity, you could go with 2 7,000 pound axles, which would get you to 14, or you could go with 3 5,000 pound axles. Can you kind of talk about the pros and cons of two
Yeah,
versus
so
three?
3 will be easier to tow, but I kind of say 26 feet is that teetering point. Tandem axle, 2 axles, is really good all the way up to 24 to 26 feet. At 26 feet, you can build light enough to stay on 2 axles, but you can also go triple axles just to make your life easier. But anything larger than triple
Yeah.
than 26, I would go triple axle. And when you're going to kind of our really big sizes, like 48 feet by 10, that's when we're going to want to do
Hmm.
4 axles. But that's not the majority of people that are building tiny houses. But um, it is
Yep.
easier to tow a triple axle. I mean, there is a learning curve because you kind of do have to take a little bit wider turns. You have a little bit of scrub when you're turning. Um, but um,
Yep.
but you do have more weight. The weight is distributed over a larger surface area, so that the tiny house handles way better. Um, but you don't
Got it.
need to do triple axles. I say on a 20 foot or a 22 or even a 24, unless you're doing something crazy heavy that you can just run by us. We've done stone
Yeah.
fireplaces in the rear of trailers, and yeah, maybe a
Oh
triple
wow.
axle on a smaller trailer might be ideal because of all that weight hanging
Uh
back.
huh.
But yeah, tandem, I say,
Okay.
the simple tip is tandem up to 24, 26 is the recommended moving to triple axle.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Joshua, this has been such a great session on trailers. I actually learned a lot, and I know that it's going to be really helpful for everyone. So
Thank you.
thank you
Thank
so
you for having
much.
me, Ethan.
All right, well, we stopped recording, and then there was one more thing that Joshua remembered that we didn't talk about, which is drop axles. What are drop axles?
Yeah, so there's two standard types of axles. There's the standard one where you have a 26-inch high deck height. And then the
Mm-hmm.
drop axles is a popular upgrade on any capacity, and it actually lowers the deck 4 inches lower to the ground. So
Mm-hmm.
you have a 22-inch high deck height. That means if we have this static 13 feet 6-inch high from the ground to the top of the house, the best way to gain more square footage or height inside there is to do drop axles. And
Mm-hmm.
4 inches may not seem like a lot, but if you've ever slept in a tiny house loft, 4 inches is a lot. And so you would gain that headroom
Yep.
inside the loft. And the great thing about drop axles too is it's an equal exchange of capacity. If you're getting a 24-foot 14K trailer, you get drop
Mm-hmm.
axles. You're getting a 24-foot 14K drop axle trailer. They're as strong as their straight counterpart, and
Yep.
they've been around for 100 years. So it's a very, very great design, and it's an option to get more interior space in your tiny house. And we've even done them on our very, very large trailers. So they
Nice.
definitely do have a practical use in all size tiny houses. So
Awesome. Thank you.